Thank you very much, Lynn. I think this will be a useful segue from what Dan Reichert just had to say. Dan talked a lot about barriers to the invention and especially commercialization of new technologies, newly invented technologies. And I think that's one thing that carbon pricing can really help promote. But there are two other channels which are highly relevant as well. Just put aside the issue of invention. What can we do with existing technologies or existing capital? Well, one thing we can do is we can encourage fuel switching. That is, refiners can be encouraged to shift away from conventional fuels that are high polluting or high carbon intensive, high greenhouse gas intensive, toward cleaner fuels. At the same time, electric utilities can be encouraged to shift away from fossil-based generation to renewable generation. So those channels of fuel switching are also very important. I'll say something about that. And then beyond that, through emissions pricing, you can engage one more channel, and that's the channel of conservation. Putting aside for the moment how things are produced, if we conserve and use less electricity or use less refined products like gasoline, we can also do something to address global climate change. Now, I'm an economist. I'm an environmental economist. I don't think it's an oxymoron, by the way. And one thing as an economist that I do is I think not only is something feasible, which is the preoccupation of a lot of engineers, to think, can we do it? Can we devise this technology? But to go a step further and say, is it worth bringing it to market? Are the benefits, are the savings enough to justify what costs might be involved? And the good news is that economics says unequivocally that in certain circumstances it is worth doing. It may not be a free lunch, but it's a sandwich worth buying. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And the first question really is, on this slide, is why intervene? Why should we bring in Big Brother, the big hand arm of government, to be involved? And what economics says about this is that in certain circumstances, markets don't do so well on their own, and there is in principle a role for government intervention. How many of you are familiar with, have seen the term externality and what it implies about the market? About half of you. Well, an externality is a cost that results from a transaction that's not taken into account directly by those involved in the transaction. So, for example, an electric utility that's deciding where to purchase its generation, in the absence of government intervention, fossil-based generation is, from a social point of view, too cheap because certain costs associated with that generation, namely the pollution costs or the climate change costs, aren't being internalized, aren't being accounted for. And as a result, in the presence of externalities, there's a market failure. And that means producers and consumers rely too much on goods or services that are environmentally harmful. It also means that the technology and innovation suffer because there's insufficient incentive to develop new technologies when the conventional technology, in some sense, are coming in too cheap. It creates too much of a barrier toward new innovation. The good news is that in principle, dealing with externalities, such as the climate damages associated with combusting coal, dealing with those externalities through public policy can actually be worth it. It can improve the market outcome in the sense that the benefits to us, to society, in the form of avoided climate damages are worth whatever extra costs might be imposed on consumers and firms. Now that takes a long time to bring out, and there actually have been Nobel Prizes won by elucidating this formally. But that's the good news, and I want to try to give you some of the implications of that. So I'm suggesting, yes, when there's externalities, there's a role for government intervention. And the question then is, why intervene in a particular way? Why use emissions pricing? There are lots of other ways to intervene, some of which Dan talked about. Let me contrast three basic channels. One would be direct regulation of emissions, say through emissions quotas, which are often used. Mandated technologies where the government says, like a CAFE standard, you must use this certain technology in order to, let's say a performance standard, to achieve a certain amount of miles per gallon. Or to mandate a specific way of producing. Or a performance standard. That's direct regulation, and that can be very, very helpful. Another approach which applies to invention more directly is subsidies, for example, to research and development toward clean technologies. And a third approach, the one I'm going to focus on, is emissions pricing. And emissions pricing are the two basic forms here, and we'll see that they're kind of mirror images of each other. One is carbon tax, the other is cap and trade. And what I'm going to suggest is that emission pricing has, as well as subsidies to R&D, these approaches have certain advantages over direct regulation in that they give firms more flexibility to find the least cost way of reducing emissions. Whereas if you mandate a particular technology, you don't really give the firms as much flexibility. Firms might have more information than the government. They may actually have more to do on their own to figure out how to achieve the result more at lower cost. So here's some rationales for emissions pricing. The first I've already suggested is cost effectiveness. It's estimated that in the context of sulfur dioxide emissions reductions to deal with acid rain, studies have suggested there's a 35 to 50% savings as a result of the U.S. having applied a cap and trade or emissions pricing system relative to what would have happened if they had used the prevailing regulatory approach that already applied. And similar numbers apply in the climate change context as well. And a more perhaps technical answer, and I won't go into details here, is that through emissions pricing you encourage the various emitters, the various facilities that are involved in pollution, each to reduce emissions up to the point where the cost to them at the margin of reducing emission just equals the tax savings or the savings in terms of having to pay the price of emissions. And that means at the margin, the costs of reduction are the same across facilities, and it turns out that's the most cost-effective way to achieve a given target. Because otherwise it could be that through other kinds of regulation, some facilities could have reduced more at very low cost, other facilities could have reduced more, it would have cost them very much. You're not saving society the most if there's a wide variation in the cost at the margin of reducing emissions. A second issue, and this is the point I made at the very beginning, is efficiency, by which I mean net benefits to society. The good news here is that emissions pricing internalizes the cost that would otherwise be external. And under those circumstances, so long as you set the price right, and that's a big if, that as long as the carbon tax isn't too high relative to what we estimate to be the social cost of carbon, or similarly, as long as the cap and trade allowance price isn't too high, reflecting the stringency of the allowance cap, then in fact it will be worth it. It will raise prices to industry, it will pass on costs to consumers, but those additional costs to industry and to consumers will be more than offset by the benefits to society in terms of avoided climate damages. Of course, there's big information requirement here. What is the right price? And we could spend a lot of time on that. These days, the estimates that were done by an interagency task force, the US government, to try to figure out what's the external cost of combusting carbon. Original estimates centered around $21 a ton of CO2. Nowadays, those estimates have been revised upward by the US government and others to about $35, $40 a ton. So that suggests that if you have a carbon tax or if you have a cap and trade system in which the allowance price is about $35, $40 a ton, you're going to get net benefits out of it. So economics is often called the dismal science because it's often acting as a killjoy, saying, oh, don't do it, it's too costly, don't do that. Well, in this context, it says, as long as you're prudent about it, you don't over-regulate, don't set the cap too low, don't set the carbon tax too high, you're going to get net gains. There's also another aspect here, which is that a carbon tax can bring in revenue, as can a cap and trade system in which you auction out the emissions permits or allowances. A $20 per ton carbon tax or $20 per ton cap and trade system with allowances of $20 per ton, that would earn about $1.2 trillion over 10 years. That would enable you to cut the corporate income tax rate. The US now has the highest statutory rate among all the major industrialized countries, about 35%, you could cut it down to 25% just by using the revenues from a carbon tax to finance the corporate tax cut. And that has a lot of policymakers excited. Of course, it's a two-edged sword. There are many that say, yeah, but the whole problem is as soon as you start bringing in new revenues, whether it's through a carbon tax or through auctioned allowances, you know what's going to happen. It's just going to expand the role of government. We're not going to rebate the revenues in the form of tax cuts or rebate it to households. We're going to spend it on lavish government projects. So the detractors will be worried about anything that brings in new revenue. And that remains a controversial issue. So what's the difference between these two approaches, carbon taxes or cap and trade? Up to now, I've tried to make the case that they both allow flexibility, which enhances cost effectiveness, which means in many contexts, not all of them, but in many contexts, it can enable us to achieve an environmental target like emissions reductions target at lower cost than would be possible through conventional regulation. But of these two, which one to choose? Well, there's disagreements over this too. They are kind of opposite sides of the same coin, as I mentioned. A carbon tax, you set the price of emissions, that's the tax rate. So if it's a $20 per ton carbon tax, that means for each unit of emissions that a tax facility faces, it's paying 20 bucks. Similarly, under cap and trade, if the allowance price is 20 bucks, for each extra unit of emissions, it's going to cost you 20 bucks. But in the carbon tax, you know that price because it's set by the regulator. You might set the whole time profile of carbon taxes, maybe start at $10, rise over time, up to $40 over time, something like that. There's relatively little uncertainty about that as long as the government holds to its pledge. What is uncertain is how much emissions reductions you're going to get as a result. That depends on the market and how much people respond to the carbon tax. So some environmentally oriented individuals would say they're less comfortable with the carbon tax because it doesn't set a firm cap. The reverse is the case under cap and trade. Under cap and trade, what you set is the quantity. That's the cap. That's the total amount of emissions allowances put into circulation. So, as long as the government enforces the cap may differ year by year, but you know how much total emissions are going to be by the covered sectors. What you don't know in the cap and trade case is the price. That's going to depend on the market and the demand and supply of allowances. And we don't know exactly what the price will be in advance. We might be able to estimate it. But you can imagine some groups will be upset with this idea, with this alternative, particularly certain business groups who want certainty about the future prices. They want to know, how much it's going to be. New inventors, engineers are going to want to know, okay, if conventional technologies are going to face a certain carbon price, we want to know what allowance price, we want to know what that is because that affects how much we want to invest in these alternative technologies. So there remains debate about this. And if you want to have a lot more information on this, on my website I have a recently completed paper. My website is www.stanford.edu/Goulder. I have a recent paper done with a recent graduate of Stanford named Andrew Shine called Carbon Taxes versus Cap and Trade. And what we find is that, neither approach dominates, that there are pluses and minuses of each, not only along the locus of uncertainty dimension, but along other dimensions as well. One thing I am struck by, however, is the seriousness of potential price volatility under cap and trade systems. We've seen that in the Los Angeles region at the time of the 2000 energy crisis in California. We've seen a fair amount of it in the European Union's emissions trading scheme. So I think that if there is a weak underbelly of cap and trade, it's that. But I'm not saying don't do cap and trade. I'm just saying that's probably its biggest weakness compared to a carbon tax, is the potential for price volatility. But also, I would say I'd be delighted with either emissions pricing approach if the U.S. government could come up would come up with one, would be willing to take one up. And just to show you that these are not pie in the sky ideas, this is showing that carbon taxes do exist in other countries and in the British Columbia province, as you know. The range of these vertical bars is the carbon tax rate, which may vary, because in some countries the rates differ depending on the particular sector to which it's applied. So in some sense, it's not a strict carbon tax. The actual rate per unit of carbon may differ. But it's available in a lot of places. China is beginning to experiment with both cap and trade and carbon taxes. Cap and trade exists elsewhere as well. Very briefly, 10 states have combined into a single cap and trade market in the Northeast called the RGGI program, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. California's AB 32, which was promulgated in 2006. Since January of 2012, the cap and trade system has been in place in this state. And I think people are holding their breath. The detractors said it would kill the California economy. I'm involved in an advisory board to try to assess what effect it has had and will have on the economy. Not easily done because you don't always know what the counterfactual is, but we're looking at it. And in many ways, many are heaving a sigh of relief because there's no strong evidence that California economy has suffered as a result of AB 32's cap and trade system. Federal level, nothing at this point. Internationally, examples are the Kyoto Protocol and the European Union's emissions trading scheme. What are the prospects? I think Dan probably mentioned some of the politics associated with climate policy. You may have heard that earlier today already. You know, nothing happening in this Congress, virtually certain. Maybe in the future, but it's going to take some time. In the absence of that, Obama, as you may know through his State of the Union message, he said, if Congress won't act, I will, under the auspices of the Clean Air Act, using other instruments than emissions pricing. So I think there's good news and bad news there. For those like myself who are very concerned about climate policy, it's good that there is a vigorous commitment. Some is through CAFE standards, tighter standards for emissions from coal-fired plant, fuel economy standards. Those were actually committed to years ago, but he's holding true to that commitment over time that it would tighten up. Also for electric power plants, there's going to be tighter emission standards for coal-fired power plants. Many have vowed to fight that hard. Details have not yet been worked out, but Obama administration seems committed to that. And so I think the good news is this will do something. The bad news is, in my view, that there are more cost-effective instruments that could be invoked, namely emissions pricing. But perhaps half a loaf is enough to be satisfied with. So I'm going to, in my last 5 minutes, just talk about some estimated impacts of carbon tax or emission or cap and trade. The first will be from a computer model that I've developed over the years of US climate change policy. And it looks at the costs of carbon taxes, cap and trade, or other initiatives like clean energy standards. It doesn't take into account the environmental benefits, so it's really only looking at one side of the ledger. And we look at a carbon tax, for example. It starts at a little over $10 a ton today and rises up to about $40 a ton. So that's in the range that's been estimated to be the social cost of carbon. So it seems like a relevant range to think about. And what it shows is that over time, as the tax grows, so does the amount of emissions reduction fall. The blue is the reference case, or the no policy case. The red is the case with policy. And you get something like a 20 to 25% reduction ultimately as a result of putting that tax in place. Also brings in a lot of revenue, as I already suggested. Our estimates for revenue are similar to those by the US Congressional Budget Office. Be enough to finance significant reductions in other taxes or to pay for various green projects. And then, of course, politically, and just to say, does it make sense? What we find is that this carbon tax is not free, that although it triggers some new technologies, new innovation, it actually does cost the economy something. But what it costs is less than the estimated benefits in terms of the environment. And the way you can make it cost relatively little is by rebating the revenue in the form of cuts in the most onerous existing taxes, and those include some corporate income taxes. Whereas if you give the taxes back, or the revenues back as a lump sum, it costs a lot more. Maybe more on that later. The last thing I want to say is, so what this says is it's not a free lunch, but again, I'd say it's a lunch worth buying because these costs are much less than the estimated environmental benefits associated with that reduction in emissions. We could also ask, not only what are the benefits and costs in the aggregate, which is what I just looked at, but is it fair? And one concern is that a carbon tax could disproportionately hurt the poor. Same for cap and trade, because it's going to raise the cost of energy, particularly the cost of electricity, and the cost of gasoline and other fuels. And as you probably know, low-income households spend a disproportionately large fraction of their income on energy because it occupies a bigger share of their income. So they would be disproportionately hurt by either of these measures if they're put in simply. And this is some work that's done by someone who was in the Obama administration until recently. Now his name is Gib Medcalf. He's now back at Tufts. And it's looking at the percentage impact of income that would be lost, or let's say the increase in the cost of living to different income deciles, starting with the lowest income decile on the left, highest income on the right. And this is if you don't do anything special with the revenues. You notice that the lowest income households face the biggest cost from $15 per ton carbon tax, or equivalently $15 per ton emissions allowance prices. However, you can do something with the revenue to offset this. You can devote the revenue to basically lump sum or per capita reductions in rebates to households. That means for the lowest income households, this is going to represent a large share of their income, much smaller for the highest shares. That is, give the same rebate to every household. For low income households, that's going to be a big share of their income. For high income households, small. And what does that do? Well, it makes the effects much more even. Indeed, the low income households would benefit overall despite the increase in the cost of living. So there are ways through judicious revenue recycling of dealing with what would otherwise be an inequity that many would associate with these, and this could be helpful to bringing things through politically. So in sum, I'm suggesting that emissions pricing does have a lot of attractions relative to conventional regulation. Don't misunderstand me. I think there are circumstances under which conventional regulation is better and should be maintained. But there are, I think, a lot of circumstances in which emissions pricing's flexibility has significant advantages. And economic analysis, I really didn't have time to get into this, but I'm not pushing emissions pricing as the only channel. Combined with direct technology promotion, such as contests or R&D subsidies, the two are both endorsed by economic analysis. Third, provided the price isn't too high, emissions pricing does yield net gains. The cost to society are more than offset by the benefits, the value that we attached to the avoided environmental damages. Fourth, through judicious recycling, you can help avoid an inequitable impact across household income groups. And I think that can make the policy more palatable. This is actually something that's going on now in California. There's still debate about what to do, hasn't yet been determined, with the revenues that California is going to get from its cap and trade system, in which a lot of the allowances are being auctioned. They're going to rely more and more on auctioning over time. There's a lot of revenues coming in. Different groups are haggling for those revenues, but some say what we need to do is rebate it, especially to lower income groups, to avoid an inequitable outcome. And finally, it is being used widely, both cap and trade and carbon taxes. But in the US, at the national level, we don't have it. And we could talk at length about why the politics is stalled and what's behind that. But hopefully over time, things will change. I do sense that the American public gradually seems to be moving more and more in favor of vigorous climate policy, but it's going to take a long time. So I'll stop now and take your questions. Thank you. Yes.
So how to measure the amount of carbon dioxide people pay for that? So how to measure that? How much people pay for that? What's the instrument and also do this?
You're not asking how you measure how much emissions come out, but rather what's the value or the damage associated with those emissions?
You're right.
Is that what your question is? Yeah. Well, that's economics is not the hardest science in the world, but there are lots of environmental economists who try to do that. And what they do is they first get natural scientists and others to figure out what are the biophysical effects. using climate models and other models, how much would biodiversity be compromised, how much sea level rise would occur, how much would there be effects on agriculture. Then the next step is to convert that into monetary terms. That's very tricky, but there are ways to do that through surveys. Say, what's it worth to you, I'm being somewhat simplistic here, to avoid this particular biophysical effect. There's also ways of trying to find out what it's worth to people based on what they actually do in their behavior. So for example, by looking at how much people pay for ecotourism, you can get a sense as what it's worth to people to preserve biodiversity. So there's a whole range of approaches. None is perfect. I think they're improving, and that's what lies behind, I'm glad you asked that question, this notion of $20 to $35 or $40 a ton is the damage. It's based on that kind of analysis, and if you were interested in looking more how they did that, look at the Interagency Task Force. Google that and social cost of carbon, and they will go in. Lots of the appendices show exactly how that was done. I don't know who was next. You in the back? I'll get to you in a sec.
Can you speak to the failure of the Australia carbon taxing program and the underperformance of the EU ETS and what that means for domestic policy analysis?
Well, these are tough questions, but let me focus on the EU ETS. Some claim, and your question seemed to claim that the EU ETS has been a failure. And the reason that it's adduced for that is that the prices, the allowance prices, have been very, very low, and suggesting that, we haven't really, we didn't set the allowance, the EU didn't set the allowance prices high enough to encourage greater reductions. I think you can look at it the other way, which is they set a target, and the fact that that target of emissions reduction could be achieved lower than originally expected, I think is good news overall. It doesn't mean the policy has failed, the cap and trade system failed. It means that the technologists and the engineers and others have won. Now it's true we can now tighten up, ratchet down the cap under the EU, but I don't think this attests to a failure of the program. There's also a minor point here, which is that the first phase of the European Union's program, there was a fair amount of volatility, but that was really a test phase. And I don't think it's really fair to use that as evidence that the system didn't work. It's more what happened in phases 2 and the subsequent phase 3 that's relevant. So I think that the EU should probably tighten its cap, but I don't think it really indicates a problem with the mechanism of cap and trade per se. What does this imply about the US? Well, I don't know. I think it implies that one has to be very careful how to interpret cap and trade. You can be sure that the detractors and the deniers will find every possible argument to say cap and trade has failed. I don't think that the evidence is all that clear that cap and trade doesn't work, but I would qualify that by saying that emissions price volatility is something to be concerned about. There is a way to enhance a cap and trade program to deal with emissions price volatility, and that's to accompany it with what's called a price collar. And that is if the price achieves some ceiling level, you then introduce new allowances into the system to prevent the price from going higher. And similarly, you can have a price floor, so if the price goes down to this floor level, the government withdraws allowances from circulation to prevent it from going any lower. That's something in between a carbon tax and cap and trade, and many of the proposals and indeed programs have that. I thought there was a question over here. I can't remember who it was. Was it you?
Actually, I don't think it was me.
Oh, it wasn't you. Oh, here. Okay, that was a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
You talked about different things to do with revenues generated by carbon taxes
Right.
or cap and trade systems, including rebates, constant rebates across different income
Groups.
brackets, income groups, or let's say rebates on onerous corporate taxes.
Right.
Are those two mutually exclusive? Is there enough money that was generated by this, or do we have to pick between a slowdown in the economy or disproportionate penalty with lowering the rules?
You can use, in theory, the revenues can be used through any combination of rebates to households and cuts in existing marginal or tax rates. And it really becomes a political issue. And here I think that there is a trade-off between fairness and efficiency. For fairness, we might want to put a lot of effort into rebates to households that are lump sum, because that will even out the effects across households. But I think it's also helpful to reserve a certain amount for one, investment in green technologies, and number two, cutting the marginal rates of particularly onerous taxes. Because it turns out, and some of my work is focused on this, by using the revenues to cut existing tax rates, marginal rates, you actually get the tax system to avoid some of its distortions to work more smoothly. So there's a balance to be struck. I haven't exactly given you the numbers. It looks like the state of California, however, is going to use a combination. There's going to be some direct rebates to households, as well as some money that's being used for green projects, and a little bit used for tax relief to go to the general fund. So the actual proportions haven't been worked out yet. I think there was a question in the back, yes?
Is there a difference in costs between the cap and trade and just the flat carbon tax? Each system brings along a lot of administration.
Great question. Apart from administrative costs, theory at least indicates that if a cap and trade system and a carbon tax are of the same magnitude, that is, they both have the same allowance prices. If the stringency of the cap and trade system gives an allowance price of X, that's the same impact on the economy as a carbon tax of X. So that they actually should have the same effect. Now, that's apart from administrative costs. If you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said, that's it, they're really the same. But I've recently come to the view that it's a little bit slightly more complicated to implement a cap and trade system, because you not only need to keep track of emissions, which you do under a carbon tax, but you have to keep track of who owns what in terms of allowances, and that adds a little bit of an administrative burden. So in that sense, I think a cap and trade system, even if it was somewhat paired with a carbon tax, might be slightly more expensive.
All right, well, thank you very much, Larry.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Thank you.